Wonderful. So thank you, everyone, for coming. It's really, truly a pleasure to be able to speak to you all today, and particularly to be in this place, being from Portugal, right? And seeing how dynamic CIBIO, is and what a potential there is, in the student body, the research staff, all of that. It's truly something to be proud of. And so that makes me even more eager to speak to you all today about the work that I do. So today, my initial title is the one that I saw that you can see there, but I took the liberty to adapt things a little bit. So I'm going to talk to you about 10 ideas that I think we need to retire if you really want to be, effective in influencing behavior to ultimately conserve biodiversity. So I'll start with the two slides some of you already seen, which I only half apologize for because I really do like these slides. So the first one, or the first thing I want to sort of talk about is this idea that really threats, we sometimes talk about threats to biodiversity in sort of quite abstract terms, but in the end, really, if you boil it down, they're really just about things people do. People individually, as groups, as institutions, through policy, through other means, we are the ones who drive these processes that we sometimes discuss in abstract terms when we say biological resource use, when we say overexploitation, when we say pollution, when we say invasive species. Those are just things that are the outcomes of actions that we take as a species around the world, every minute, every second. And so really, if we want to mitigate those threats, ultimately, it really is about people. And so that's why I keep saying that conservation is an exercise in human persuasion. The other things are nice to have, but this is the one thing we must have in order to conserve biodiversity. And so I'll go through 10 ideas that I think we need to change, that we need to change tact a little bit as a community. We need to do differently. And I purposely left this presentation a little bit short so we have enough time for questions and discussion, which I hope we'll have at the end. So the first thing, number 10, we'll start as a countdown to make it more exciting. Awareness is a worthy goal. So very often, I'm in conversations with colleagues, or we're planning projects, and there's a lot of discussion around awareness raising. We need to raise awareness. We need to do some awareness raising. People don't know about this, and we need to make sure that they know about this. And of course, the assumption there is that if they do know, if they gain knowledge, that they'll change their behavior, right? But that's quite a big assumption. So all of us sitting here have enormous amounts of knowledge of biodiversity and sustainability. I think very few of us would say we have perfect lifestyles, perfectly sustainable lifestyles, right? Even though we are at the extreme end level of amount of knowledge towards biodiversity, right? So take this diagram. So the theory of planned behavior is, I think, would easily be arguable to be the most popular theory when it comes to describing how people make decisions. Very widely used, right? We can debate the merits. Is it the best one, or what the flaws are? But it stands that it is very widely used across many social science fields. Now, notice there that there isn't knowledge, awareness, component to this theory, right? And the reason there isn't is because its role is seen as being really quite minor in decision making. Other things, attitudes, social norms, in this case, subjective social norms, perceived behavioral control, so how much in control we are of particular situations, our intentions, and then ultimately behavior, but there really isn't an awareness and a knowledge component here. And I think that if you ask, I think that reveals the extent to which it is really a quite secondary aspect of actually influencing what physically happens in the world. Now, what I'm not saying is that never in any case does knowledge have a role to play. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. There certainly are cases where with knowledge we can get quite far in terms of changing. But what I'm also saying is that if your goal is to win the gold medal of running the marathon, the Olympics, measuring how many people buy running shoes is not going to get you a very good indication of that. Sure, I mean, you can, it's true that every single person who's won the gold medal in the Olympics in running the marathon has running shoes, right? So that's absolutely true. But it's also true that hundreds of thousands of other people who have running shoes will never win the gold medal running the marathon, right? And that's what the awareness and behavior relationship is like. Yes, sure, in some cases, we have some places where they coincide, but the vast majority of cases, it won't get us where we need to be when it comes to actual influencing what people do at the end of the day. So that's saying I'll go on to number 9. Focusing on children as our best path to impact. Very often, whenever there's a project, we're thinking about activities, we're thinking about things we can do, automatically someone will tell me, oh, we can do something with schools, for example. We can do that. Okay. I mean, again, what I'm not saying is that you should never work with schools, and that schools are never the key audience in order to achieve the biodiversity change that you need or that you want to see in the world. But what I'm saying is that if you think that they're a target group that does not vote, does not have a lot of ability to purchase things as a consumer, right? So they play secondary roles at best as consumers, probably not going to deliver the change that you want to see, at least directly. Now, when I say this, people tell me 2 things. They tell me, oh, but in 20 years they might, right? To which I say, well, if you think about the usual types of impacts you see in the behavioral intervention, usually single digits percentage change, right? So we see very small changes for any single individual behavioral intervention. And you're thinking about those effects in a 20-year time period, so 20 years later. I think it's quite likely that what you're going to get 20 years later is going to be quite residual. Also, what people tell me is, oh, but they influence their parents. And I think there's some literature that supports that idea, right? But again, if you think that usually the impacts we get are quite small, if you're working with a secondary audience, right? So you're working with second level impacts, you're working with an audience that then you hope will influence another group. Again, your chances of success, the likelihood of the magnitude of your effect is going to be, again, quite a lot smaller, right? So I would say, again, what I'm saying is not that you should never work with children. What I'm saying is that it's really way more challenging to achieve the effects we want to see in the world working with very young audiences than it is working with adults, even if we admit that in some ways adults might be trickier to change. I think our path to impact inevitably means working mostly with adult audiences. Some of these are a little bit, provocations. We hopefully you'll react, and we can have a discussion at the end. Right. So number 8, this idea that individuals don't matter, right? This idea that it's really out of our hands. Nothing we do can possibly make any difference, because at the end of the day, it's all to do with industrial impact, and so we can do whatever we want because really it's down to governments regulating industry and so forth. But actually, once you think about the scale of change that we're setting ourselves for when it comes to some of these timelines for carbon, for example, right? Some of these carbon reductions, we're setting horizons 2030, 2050, right? So these are really short time frames in the grand scheme of things. To think about these as either or is to set ourselves up to fail. Really, we need both of those things in order to achieve the goals that we have. And to set them up as a dichotomy is a sure way of making sure we don't achieve the goals we want to get to. So that's my view. And of course, when I say that individuals have responsibility, what I'm not saying is that all individuals have the same responsibility. That's certainly not true, right? Because as individuals, we have very different types of impacts in the environment. If you break it down by country, for example, you'll see that certainly are not the individuals in the countries here that have the biggest responsibility. obviously, these up here are the ones that really bear the brunt of responsibility when it comes to the impacts they have in the world, right? But these two things are not mutually exclusive, right? When I say individuals have a role to play, an important role to play even, I'm not saying everyone has the same role, everyone has the same level of responsibility, because the impacts are also not the same. Number 7, financial incentives as the best motivator. So often we think a lot about money as an incentive to get people to change in some way. But actually, in many contexts, when we monetize incentives, what we're actually doing is we're crowding out intrinsic motivations that people have to conserve the natural world. Right? So in essence, we're making ourselves we're making ourselves pay for something that people voluntarily would be willing to do for other reasons, because they don't see the same nature in the same sort of market context that a lot of us from contexts where this capitalism is dominant do. And the problem with that change is that incentives, monetary incentives programs, they can work and they have achieved good results, but the challenge is, how do you maintain them over time? Once you start paying, when do you stop paying? And what happens when you stop paying? And scale. So some of these, for example, payments for ecosystem services or environmental services have tried to take these payments to scale, and the results are really varied. In some cases, they have completely failed. In a few cases, they've worked. Overall, we see there's quite a lot of uncertainty as to what they can deliver, because when you take them to scale, they're hard to implement. Right? So again, what I'm not saying is that you should never use incentives for anything. But what I am saying is that it's worth thinking twice, or really examining our assumptions when it comes to this idea that we inevitably have to always be paying people everywhere if you want them to be environmental stewards. There are contexts where that makes a lot of sense, and contexts where that's actually counterproductive. Number 6, this idea of the one size fits all. I think I think behavioral interventions often are a little bit like fishing. Right? So if you want to go fishing, you need to know what sort of fish you want to catch in order to choose the type of bait, the type of hook, where you're going to fish, right? If you don't know what type of fish you're after, it's pretty difficult to make those decisions, right? Because they can be really different. They can be really different. There's freshwater fish, there's fish out in the sea, there's, of course, fish that live in different locations and places and different habits and behaviors, and that dictates how you try to fish them. And so, again, it's really important that we think about, when we're thinking, oh, I'm interested in understanding bushmeat consumption, or I'm interested in trying to reduce, let's take bushmeat as an example that came up several times across the conversations I've had in this week. So it's really important when we think about that issue, we think about, who are my consumers? Who are the people that are performing this behavior I want to influence? Because if it's 30-year-old college-educated women, that's very different from 60-year-old illiterate men. Right? Those are two very different demographics, and the way that we'll communicate them to them, the way we'll reach them, the way we'll the messaging will be completely different. And so that's one thing that's worth always noting. Now, this generates great frustration, because it means that because I'm doing bushmeat work in Brazzaville, it doesn't mean that necessarily tells me a lot about the same bushmeat work in Nairobi or in Maputo or whatever that might be. And so it does mean that whenever you go to a place, even though we have some level of knowledge, although in conservation the evidence base is usually quite thin, but we do need to do quite a lot of groundwork again and again and again, and we need to re-examine these assumptions and figure out who the audience is and all of that. And sometimes it's frustrating, because conservation being a crisis discipline, it means that we want action immediately. Now, biodiversity is disappearing. Quick, let's do it. We must implement things. And that sometimes is not possible, because we need to figure out what fish we're trying to catch, and without trying to, without how are we going to get the right bait? Probably going to guess, probably going to get it wrong. Right? Now, number 5. Now, very often this sort of crisis discipline mentality also means that when we implement an activity of some kind, we don't necessarily feel it's very urgent to really figure out, what happened as a result, right? So, we've done this, whatever that might be, a campaign on X. So what was the outcome? And this is because we have this sense that, look, what's the worst that can happen, right? You put out some articles in newspaper, you did some spots in the radio. Surely the worst case is that nothing happened, that people just continue their lives as usual, right? Surely. But actually, that's not the worst case at all. The worst case is that actually our intervention made things worse. So just to keep with the bushmeat example, maybe our campaign highlighted that bushmeat is available for sale. And a lot of people that never ate bushmeat went, oh yeah, bushmeat. Yeah, that's a good idea. I should go and get some of that. And the way I'm putting it out, it just seems like maybe it's an outlandish thing. But if you go to literatures that are way more robust than our own, you'll see that the number of negative results, right? So those interventions that have opposite effects is not small at all. It is not at all inconceivable or surprising, indeed, that an intervention has the opposite effect of what it set out to do. In a recent article, they compared registered reports. So those reports or those articles where you publish the methodology first, and the article is accepted on the basis of the methodology, right, rather than the actual results. So those registered reports, in essence, authors have nothing to lose when it comes to submitting a null result or a result that's contrary to their expectations, right? So in those registered reports, about 44% of the results were positive. So where the hypotheses of the authors were confirmed. And then they looked at the traditional literature, let's call it. And in that literature, 96% of similar comparable cases were of articles that where the hypothesis was confirmed, right? Which basically just means that through the traditional sort of academic publishing, what happens is all the null results, all the things that are contrary to what we expect get left in the drawer. No one wants to read those. Those aren't exciting. It's a little bit embarrassing even, right? But again, these are not things that are unexpected at all. So I have a collaboration with Zoomarine where we do a lot of experiments using visitors in the park. We recently, we were feeling very smart. We felt that Zoomarine has a program where they have these bracelets where all profits of the sale of these bracelets costs, I think, 3 euros, I think it is. And so €1.80 goes to the World Parrot Trust, which is a leading sort of bird conservation NGO. And we were like, okay, this is great. We're going to use behavioral science to increase the sale of bracelets, right? So, more donations to a conservation NGO. This is going to be great. So they sell the bracelets at these bird exhibition sort of shows where they show the birds around, they talk about them, they have people sit in sort of an amphitheater situation, a little bit like this, right? And then what we did was the keepers have a script that they follow every show, and we tweaked the script a little bit to include some bits of information that basically followed 3 well-known sort of behavioral biases, and then we waited, and surprise, surprise, the number of bracelets sold decreased compared to the control script, right? So we had a randomization process. We randomized the shows where our script was given. We randomized the shows where the control script was given, and it performed worse. Right? So we actually were costing conservation money, right, by trying to by our intervention. And again, am I surprised? Well, sure, a little bit. I sure hope it. It's not what I hoped for. That's not what I was in this for. I was in this for more donations. I got less donations. That's not great. It's a little bit embarrassing, yes. But I think it just shows how uncommon that is. right? And the reason this is important is because if we don't report our failures, then we cannot move on and cannot learn. And that sort of highlights the importance of measuring the impact, evaluating the activities that we do, which is something that with behavioral interventions, very often we don't do. Right? When you do communication, when you do behavioral interventions, very often we just put materials out into the ether and sort of hope for the best. Right? So I think that's one paradigm that's worth changing. Number 4, this idea that there's one way to change behavior. So very often I'm in conversation with people and they'll ask me, so, you do behavior change, so how do I do it? Well, again, it's a really boring thing to say, but it really depends. It depends on the behavior you're trying to change, what is the context of that behavior, who is the target group that you're trying to influence, what sort of resources do you have? If you have infinite resources, we can do things really very differently than if you have sometimes no resources at all, right? So all of those things really can completely change the way that we approach a behavioral change issue, right? And it will depend enormously. The proposed solution will depend enormously on these contexts. Now, one thing I get asked a lot is about nudges. What about nudges? Shouldn't be doing nudges, conservation nudges, right? And again, yeah, there are some instances, some contexts where making nudges can really show potential. So if you have not come across this term, basically this idea of nudging refers to small changes that we make in the way that the information is given to people, so that people choose one alternative versus another. Let me give you an example. Imagine a situation where you're invited to. They tell you about an event and they say, okay, so there's going to be lunch given with this event, right? And they have two options. They can either set the default to vegetarian or to sort of traditional, right? And you have an option. You can set the default one way or another. There's no, that you have to make some choice. But we know that depending on how you set the default, people are more likely to choose one or another, because very often people will just be like, yeah, okay, whatever's the default, I'll just go with that. Right, so that's an example of a nudge. Right, so this has been used in many instances, like getting people to save more for retirement, for example, ordering the shelves in a supermarket to get them to pick more healthier products with less calories, for example, things like that. But what I'm trying to show here is that in a recent meta-analysis, they actually couldn't find an impact of nudges. Right? And this doesn't mean that, oh, nudges don't work, we should abandon them and never talk about this again. What I'm saying is they don't work everywhere for everything, in every context, right? Again, it's context dependent, which is sort of, it's not a headline grabber, right? I'm not going to get in, people get very excited by saying this, but I think it is true. So it's worth repeating. Number 3, all right, top 3 now. I mean, I don't really order them in any particular way, but anyway, this idea that change is permanent. So, it's true that once we sit down and we think about it, it is sort of a little bit obvious that it's not permanent, right? That, of course, all of us change our behavior every day and we're influenced by lots of different factors. But when it comes to implementation, we act as if it's permanent. And what I mean by that is often we think about, I'll follow on with the bushmeat example, right? Okay, bushmeat example. Bushmeat, there's some consumption. Want to reduce that consumption because it threatens maybe wildlife, maybe livelihoods, right? And then we do a 3-year project and then we move on. Something else. Okay, we've done that. We can. But imagine if it was a law, right? Imagine you're the state. You've changed the law on something. And imagine you say, okay, there's a new law. We're going to tell the police to enforce this law for the next 3 years, and then we're going to stop. And then we're going to just move on to another law. Imagine if it worked like that. That's not what happens, right? We know that the enforcement of a law is something that is regular, needs reinforcing, needs to be constant in order for it to really work. And it's similar when it comes to influencing behavior. We need to be reinforcing the message. We need to be repeating. We need to make sure that people are aware. They don't forget what it is that we're putting forward, right? Same thing. And I realize that a lot of this comes down to constraints of budget and resourcing. And, that's a fair, it's a very fair point. Certainly all of us are under-resourced. But very often, we sort of just think of it as like, oh, we've achieved this reduction, then it's done. We can move on to other things. Interestingly enough, there's a term called behavioral decay, right? So this idea that as behavior changes, then you see more change in the short term, and then the change wears off over time. One of the most encouraging results, I couldn't find a review on this, interestingly enough, but one of the most interesting or sort of positive results I've seen is from this energy conservation program. And even in this situation, they have a decay of 10 to 20% a year of the effect they have, which, by the way, is less than 10% of change. But still, right? If given this sort of shiny example, you have 10 to 20% decay a year. My experience is that in many instances, where I've done work, the decay is not measured in years; it's measured in weeks or months, right? You can see how quickly time just basically dissolves any change we're able to generate, right? And this just reinforces this idea that it's not a one-shot thing. You don't go in and influence something and then it's done, you move on, but it's something that actually does require sort of an ongoing effort. 2, this focus on reaching many people. So very often you'll be doing some work that focuses on, say, an aspect of communication, trying to influence whatever behavior you're interested in, and you'll be told things like, oh, we've already reached 100,000 people, or we've already reached 10 million people, right? It's a very common sort of type of metric. Of course, this sort of forgets this idea of, right, so if, again, just to follow on with the fishing metaphor, right, it doesn't really matter if you're fishing and you have your hook in the water. It doesn't really matter how many fish have swum by your hook. That's not a metric of how good of a fisher you are, right? That doesn't count at the end of the day. What counts is how many fish you actually catch. So, we did some experiments on value framing using Facebook ads, right? So basically, we presented different Facebook ads framed differently, different people across 5 countries, and we looked at how the framing of the ads, the message of the ads, influence their donation behavior, right? Now, about 6 million is the number of impressions that our ads got. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean 6 million people, but it does mean 6 million times, right? These ads were served 6 million times, right? Probably a few repeats, but I think it's pretty safe to say that easily we're talking about hundreds of thousands of different users, right, that looked at those ads. Would anyone like to guess how many donations we got? Anyone? Give me a number. 1,000. More or less, anyone?
Can you tell us what the message is?
Yeah, so it was 5 countries. So it was India, Brazil, US, UK, South Africa. And we were talking about the importance of conserving the Western Ghats of India. So this high biodiversity region, and we're emphasizing intrinsic, extrinsic values, and we were framing it positively and negatively. So there were 4 ads in essence, four ad types. We got 1,000. Can
500.
500.
0.
0. We got 0.
0.
0.
Yeah.
0. Now, of course, you can always argue this is a single study. Maybe our ads were just rubbish, right? Which is fine, and that's certainly a possibility. But what I'm trying to get, and that point stands, how many people look at something is not a very good metric for how well that thing is, performs its function, right? And we could have gotten, a few donations with a lot less. And of course, this is with, and remember that this is with the algorithm working for us, right? We targeted our ads to people with particular characteristics, right? So that we had all of that going for us, and still we got a grand total of 0, right? Now, I hope that drives home that it's important to focus on the the goal that we have, ultimate goal, and not some, intermediate sort of proxy value, right? And then last but not least, so this idea that, the reason we cannot get to change is because happens over generations, right? You cannot get change to happen in a short amount of time. Well, we don't have a lot of cases like this in biodiversity, although actually some of the work that's currently happening with sea turtles in São Tomé and Príncipe, for example, I think shows how we can actually get São Tomé, of course, being a relatively small country, but still, I think the change there, for example, in sea turtle meat consumption is a good example of relatively, quick shift. But if you look at also the world is changing. If you look at adoption curves for different types of technology, right? So some of these things at the beginning, look how slow they were to get to a critical mass, right? But if you think about some of the latest, technologies, it's a much faster, right? Because of course we're much more interconnected. Information travels much faster, much larger distances, right? And so we're adoption of new things. And I mean, I use things here as a proxy for ideas, right? And of course, for example, the iPhone took 74 days to sell 1 million units, right? That's pretty quick. But ChatGPT took only 5 days to get to 1 million users, right? So technologies, adoption can happen really fast. And of course, with these things, are we really comparing apples to apples? Well, the point is that there are instances certainly where things have changed dramatically very quickly. And another example, of course, is the pandemic, right? Where society, globally, our behavior shifted from almost day to night. And so it is possible to change, and we are seeing change. So there's no reason why I think it's a little bit of a cop-out sometimes to say, oh, well, it's only every year, when people die that we can get change. Well, actually, that's really not true, I think. So what does it all mean, right? I went through these 10 points. What am I actually saying? What I'm saying is, in essence, that we need to focus on behavior. If it's behavior, and I firmly believe it is, that matters in the end. If that's what actually delivers the change we need to see, and that makes a difference for biodiversity, then that's what we need to be focusing on, measuring and evaluating. We need to pick audiences strategically. We need to realize that people are very different. We need to think about who it is that we want to change and why those audiences are not some others. Sometimes it's because they're the easiest to get to, but that's probably not the best criteria, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I think it's important for us to have a clear thought process when it comes to who we try to influence and why. Why is that group strategic? So it's important for us to think about where is that behavior change intervention happening, socially, culturally. Right? Very often we have a situation in conservation where people are not from the countries and the places we work in are the ones driving these processes. And it's really key and crucial that there are sort of equal partnerships, and when possible, and actually get people from those countries, the high biodiversity countries, to be the ones on the driver's seat, so that we don't have the risk of having interventions that actually just making things worse, which, as I said before, it really isn't that of an unlikely sort of situation. Change needs reinforcement. It's not a one-off process. Budgets are stretched, but unfortunately, it's a long-term. We have to be in it for the long haul if we really want to get things to get where we want to be. And this idea that understanding what works, what doesn't, and learning and improving over time is really key. But also sharing those lessons, right? As a community, we have this really strange we're in this really strange place where we're all in this together, but at the same time we have this sort of competitive relationship with each other, where because of funding, because of other things, we're often not very keen to say, hey, I tried this out, didn't work. Turns out that's really not a good option. And then we have different groups repeating the same things that, borderline everyone already knows is probably not great, options. Right? So we need to be a bit more, I think, active and transparent. And often resourcing dictates speed. So, yes, sometimes change is intergenerational because we don't have the resources that Apple does to sell iPhones, or even OpenAI has in terms of pushing its products, right? And so it's a result of our ability to get resources rather than intrinsic characteristic of behavioral and societal change. So I'll just invite questions now. Hopefully, I've said a couple of things you won't agree with, so we can now have a little bit of a back and forth. And as always, I'm happy to, if anything comes up afterwards, please drop me a line.